Hansel and Gretel, retold from the original by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time there was a kind old woodcutter. He lived with his two children, Hansel and Gretel, and their stepmother in a little cottage set in a huge forest. They were a poor family, and one night as the old woodcutter was tossing and turning in bed, he cried out, "There is a great famine in the land. How am I going to find enough food for our children?" "Don't worry," said his wife. "I've already worked something out." The woodcutter listened carefully to his cruel wife's words. "Tomorrow morning we'll take Hansel and Gretel to the deepest, darkest part of the woods. Then we'll leave them while we go and do our work. They'll never be able to find their way out on their own, and we'll be rid of them forever." "No, dear wife," said the woodcutter, "not my own children." "So you want us all to starve then, do you?" said the cruel stepmother. With a heavy heart the woodcutter agreed to the dreadful plan, but little did he know that Hansel and Gretel had been listening at the door and had heard everything. The next morning Hansel and Gretel were awake very early. Gretel wept when she remembered her wicked stepmother's cruel words. Hansel tried to comfort her. "Don't get too upset," he said. "I know the woods well. We'll find a way out." He went to check that his stepmother and father were still asleep. They were both snoring heavily, so he crept out into the garden to gather some pebbles. Quickly and quietly he filled his pockets with them. Then he tiptoed back to bed and pretended to be asleep. He'd barely had time to hide under the covers when his stepmother came barging into the room. "Get up, you lazy bones," she cried. "We're all going off to the forest to collect some wood. Here's a crust of bread for each of you, but don't you eat it before lunchtime, because that's all you're getting." Gretel hid Hansel's share under her apron, as Hansel's pockets were full of pebbles. Then the whole family set off for the woods. When they walked a little way, Hansel stopped to look back at the house. He kept doing this every few minutes. His father was puzzled. "Hansel, why do you keep stopping like that?" "Well, father, I'm just waving to my little white kitten. Can't you see him up there, sitting on the roof, waving with his paw?" Before the woodcutter had a chance to say anything, his stepmother piped up, "What a fool you are! That's not your kitten. That's the morning sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel hadn't really been looking back at his kitten. Every time he stopped, he had dropped one of the white pebbles on the path. After walking for many hours, they reached the middle of the forest. The woodcutter told Hansel, "Go and fetch me some wood and I'll light a fire for you so you don't get cold." So they gathered as much wood as they could carry, and their father set light to it. Soon the little fire was blazing. "Now, children," said their wicked stepmother, "you lie down here and have a little rest. The fire will keep you warm until we return. We're going into the forest to cut wood, and we'll come back and fetch you when we've finished." Off went the woodcutter and his wife. Hansel and Gretel sat down by the fire and ate their bread. They could hear the sounds of an axe chopping through wood, so they thought their father was nearby. But their wicked stepmother had fooled them. She had tied a bough to a dead tree, and it was being blown about by the wind. Several hours later, when they woke up, it was pitch black. Poor Gretel was afraid and started to cry. "How will we ever get out of this wood?" she said. Hansel put his arm around her. "Everything will be all right," he said. "When the moon is up, we'll find our way out of here easily." Soon the moon came up and it bathed the forest in its silvery light. Hansel took his sister by the hand and led her along the path he had made with the pebbles. They shone like little silver coins. All through the night they walked, and at daybreak they reached their father's house. Their stepmother answered the door. "You wicked children," she cried. "Why did you move from the spot where we left you? We searched everywhere for you. You have made your poor father sick with worry." Oh, how happy the woodcutter was to see his children again. He had missed them so much. While Hansel and Gretel were chattering happily, their stepmother muttered, "How on earth did they find their way out?" The stepmother stormed around the house for days after their return. She was desperate to get them out of the way. One night she told their father her plan again. "There is still a great famine in the land," she said, "and we only have half a loaf left. When that is eaten, we'll have nothing. The sooner we get rid of those children, the better. This time we'll lead Hansel and Gretel into the very heart of the wood. It's so far away from our cottage that it would be impossible for them to find their way out again. It is something we must do if we are to save ourselves." The woodcutter was used to the lively sound of his children around the house. In fact, he preferred it to his wife's constant nagging and moaning. "I would much rather share my last crumb with my own children," he told her. "We have to get rid of those children or we'll starve," his wife complained. The cruel woman wore him down with her nagging, and he had to give up in the end. Once again, Hansel and Gretel were awake, and they had heard all about the plan. "I'll just collect some more pebbles," said Hansel, but when he tried to go out into the garden, he found that his stepmother had bolted all the doors. Hansel went straight back to bed and wondered how he might outwit his stepmother. Even before the birds were awake, the wicked stepmother made Hansel and Gretel get up. She handed each of them a crust of bread. This time it was even smaller than before. Once again the whole family set off into the woods. On the way, Hansel crumbled the piece of bread in his pocket, and every few minutes he stood still and dropped a crumb on the ground. "Hansel, why do you keep stopping and looking back?" said his father. "Do try and keep up." "I'm looking back at my little pigeon, who is sitting on the roof and waving goodbye. Can't you see him, father?" "You foolish boy," said the stepmother. "That's no pigeon, that's the bright morning sun shining on the chimney." Although the stepmother kept watching him with her beady eyes, Hansel still managed to make a path with the crumbs. On and on they walked until they were deep in the heart of the forest. Here the trees were so tall and their branches so thick that the sun could only just peep through. It was cold in these parts, so the woodcutter lit a big fire. "Just sit down there, my children. If you're tired, you can have a little nap. But whatever you do, don't stray away from this place. We're going into the forest to cut wood, but we'll be back to fetch you later." Hansel and Gretel waved goodbye, and then they shared Gretel's piece of bread between them. The warmth of the fire made them feel sleepy, and soon they were fast asleep. Nobody came to fetch them, and when they woke up, everything was dark. Owls were hooting and strange birds were squawking. The heart of the wood was certainly an eerie place. Gretel started to cry, and Hansel comforted her by saying, "Dear sister, look at the full moon smiling down on us. His silvery light will show me the path of breadcrumbs I scattered on the way. We'll be back home in no time." Straight away Hansel started searching for the crumbs. "That's strange, the crumbs have gone," he thought. "The birds of the forest had eaten them all up. I'm sure we can still find a way out," he told Gretel. They both wandered about all night, desperately trying to find their way back to their father's cottage. But they could not find a path out of the wood. At last they were so tired that their legs could not carry them any longer, and they both lay down under a tree and went to sleep. In the morning they set out for their father's cottage once again, but wherever they wandered, they just ended up more lost than before. At midday they saw a little white bird sitting on a branch. The little creature led them to an incredible house. Its roof was made of cake, with a thick layer of icing and cherries on the top. The windows were made of spun sugar and crystal sweets. "Delicious!" cried Hansel. "Scrumptious!" said Gretel. Hansel broke a piece of cake off the side of the roof. "This is the best cake I've ever tasted," he cried. And just as he was about to take another huge bite, a shrill voice called out from inside, "Who's there? Who's nibbling my house?" Suddenly the door of the candy house opened, and an old witch hobbled out. When she saw the two children, her voice softened a little. "Come in, my little ones," she said. "You'll come to no harm in my cozy little cottage." The old witch led Hansel and Gretel into the house. She knew how hungry they were, so she prepared a fabulous meal for them. There were glasses of milk, cakes, and bowls full of apples and nuts. "Eat up, my dears," said the old witch. "You look as if you need fattening up." Soon they were so full that they could hardly move. The old witch had prepared 2 lovely little beds for them. They were made of the softest feathers, and when they lay down on them, they fell asleep straight away. Well, it certainly seemed as if the witch was friendly, but she wasn't as friendly as she appeared. She had been waiting a long, long time to catch some children. In fact, she found that they were so hard to come by that she had built the special candy house in the woods just to lure them in. While Hansel and Gretel were sleeping in their beds, she took a little peek at them. They'll make a nice, juicy meal," she said. licking her lips. The next morning, as Hansel and Gretel were just waking up and talking about their good fortune, the old witch grabbed Hansel and dragged him into a little cage. She locked him in there. He screamed to be let out, but the old witch didn't care. "You can scream as much as you like, my boy, but I'm not letting you out," she said. Then the old witch dragged Gretel out of her bed. "Come on, lazy bones," she said. "Fetch me some water and cook something for your brother. When he's fat, I'll eat him all up." Gretel cried bitterly, but it was no use. The old witch felt no pity. All the best food went to Hansel, and Gretel got nothing but bones and scraps to eat. Every morning the old witch hobbled over to Hansel in the cage and said, "Put out your finger, my boy, so I can feel how fat you are." Day after day she did this, but she couldn't understand it. "You don't seem to be getting any fatter," she said. She didn't realize that every time she asked Hansel to stretch out his finger, he stretched out an old chicken bone. When 1 month had passed, the old witch finally lost her patience. She just couldn't wait any longer. "I don't care whether he's too fat or too thin. Whatever he is, I'm going to eat him up now. Gretel, go and fetch me some water." Gretel feared for her own life, so she went to fetch the water. She sobbed as she carried the bucket of water to the old witch. "If only the wild beasts of the wood had eaten us," she said, "then at least we would have died together." "Hold your tongue," said the old witch, "and fetch me the kettle." So Gretel had to go and hand up the kettle and light the fire. "First we'll do some baking," said the old witch. "I've already heated the oven and kneaded the dough." She pushed Gretel towards the oven. "Creep in," said the witch, "just to check that it's heated enough to bake the bread." But Gretel knew she would try to push her in the oven and then eat her up. "I don't know how to do it. How do I get in?" she said. "You silly little thing," said the old witch. "Look, the opening is big enough. I could get in myself." So the old witch crawled towards the oven and poked her head in. Gretel quickly pushed her in and slammed the oven door. When Gretel was sure the witch was dead, she grabbed the key to Hansel's cage and let him out. "We're free at last," she cried. "The old witch is dead." Hansel and Gretel didn't have to worry about being poor or going hungry again, because in every corner of the candy house they found boxes with pearls and precious stones. "These are 1,000 times better than the pebbles," laughed Hansel. They both crammed their pockets full of them. "Now it's time to get away from the witch's wood for good, just in case there are any other witches lurking around," said Hansel. When they had wandered around for a while, they came to a big lake. "We can't get over this," said Hansel. "I can't see any boats or bridges." "No," said Gretel, "but look, there swims a duck. Perhaps if I ask her, she'll let us over." The duck swam towards them, and Gretel climbed on her back. "Both of us on her back would be too large a load," she said. So the duck took each of them across separately. When they reached the other side of the lake, they realized that they were not very far from their father's house. As soon as their father's house was in sight, they ran as fast as their legs would carry them. They found their father all alone, because their wicked stepmother had been banished from the house for good. Oh, how happy their father was to see them. "I thought I'd lost you forever," he cried, and he wept with joy. Gretel shook the pockets of her apron, while Hansel emptied his pockets. Many precious jewels rolled onto the kitchen table. "Look, we'll never go hungry again, father," cried Hansel and Gretel. "Yes, and we'll live happily together for the rest of our lives, I promise," said their father, as he hugged them both. The end.